Good evening, I'm Klaudia Czerwińska and you're watching World News Tonight, live from Warsaw. The most fighters, the most bombers, the most strikes. This is how Pete Hegseth described the plans for the US's Tuesday attacks on Iran. This as top Iranian security officials warned Donald Trump should be careful or else get eliminated. We'll have more from the Iran war and the Middle East soon, but first, as we go to air, the latest headlines.
We just don't make enough equipment. And the surging of American defense industrial capability has been at a snail's pace.
The U.S. is struggling with countering Iranian drones as Ukraine offered its expertise in the area last year.
The president prepared a draft bill which is aimed to be an excuse to veto the European program.
The Polish government braces for a presidential veto to the multi-billion-euro defense loan from the EU.
This reduction in the share of nuclear was a choice. And in hindsight, it was a strategic mistake for Europe.
The future of Europe's nuclear energy takes center stage in Paris. In the words of U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, Tuesday was to be yet again our most intense day of strikes inside Iran, with major damage dealt on all fronts. But the strikes extended beyond Tehran. According to the latest, Beirut was also affected. Our correspondent Oz Kataji is in the Lebanese capital and joins us live to give us the latest on the attacks and more. Good evening, Oz. So it's actually very good to see you well. President Trump has said that the war will be over pretty quickly. How do these statements play into what you're experiencing on the ground?
Well, strikes have continued in Lebanon. Israel and Hezbollah have continued to trade blows over the last 24 hours. And we had a statement by the IRGC responding to Donald Trump's words, saying, we will be the ones to decide when the war ends. So if America and Israel think they are going to have it their own way, the Iranians and Hezbollah seem to think they have something they can say about that in return. Now, with regards to Lebanon, there has been continued strikes over the last 24 hours, with this total death toll reported by the Lebanese Ministry of Health up to 486 Lebanese citizens killed. That doesn't delineate between combatants and non-combatants, but they have said that 84 children, at least 40 women, are among those who have been killed in Israeli strikes across Lebanon since this renewed conflict between Israel and Hezbollah began. There has also been a mass wave of displacement, with the UN authorities in Lebanon reporting 667,000 people have fled South Lebanon and parts of southern Beirut after Israel issued evacuation orders for those parts of the country as the conflict has continued to escalate. There are also growing concerns in Lebanon that this conflict may spill over the border, with Syrian authorities reporting that Hezbollah launched attacks into Syrian territory in the early hours of Tuesday morning. There is a growing concern that this war may continue to escalate out of control, certainly out of the control of Washington and Israel in this matter. Aaron Darman has a special report on how this conflict is going.
As the United States and Israel entered an 11th day of war with Iran, this unrelenting message landed from Washington.
Today will be, yet again, our most intense day of strikes inside Iran. The most fighters, the most bombers, the most strikes. Intelligence more refined and better than ever.
American fighter jets taking off to deliver on that promise. To keep hitting Tehran and strong-arm regime change, just a day after Mojtaba Khamenei was appointed as the country's new supreme leader, succeeding his late father, Ali Khamenei, even as reports suggest that he himself was wounded in the opening strikes on Iran last weekend.
It's going to lead to just more of the same problem for the country, so I was disappointed to see their choice.
Disappointment fast leading to military action, as Israel also ramped up air assaults in Iran and Lebanon, where it has extended its campaign against the Tehran-backed militia Hezbollah. To counter, Iran launched new attacks at Israel and the Gulf countries, with missile sirens reportedly heard in the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, and drones downed in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. The strikes at Gulf neighbors landing, despite Iran's president promising that they would not happen without initial provocation.
The decision was communicated to the armed forces that from now on they should not attack neighboring countries or fire missiles unless those countries attack us.
Big mistake by the Iranian regime to start targeting its neighbors right away, exposing who they are and what they're all about, indiscriminate targeting.
It comes after oil and gas prices skyrocketed, then fell sharply on Tuesday to under $100 a barrel, once Donald Trump had suggested the war is, quote, very complete. But as Iran insists the oil blockade through the Strait of Hormuz, which handles a fifth of global oil supply, will stay in place until U.S.-Israeli attacks end, the boss of the world's largest oil exporter, Saudi Arabia's Aramco, is still warning of catastrophic consequences.
The whole system is becoming a little bit paralyzed, but especially in the Middle East Gulf. So until that lifts, until those tanker movements restore kind of normal operations, we're going to see things like gasoline prices elevated.
At the same time, European leaders are weighing in with urgency on the escalating conflict.
We are particularly concerned that there is apparently no common plan for how to bring this war to a swift and convincing conclusion. I do not believe that profound changes in regimes and political systems can be achieved through bombing alone.
A message back to Washington that only prolonged violence may not affect the change it wants to see in the Middle East.
Kyiv is reaching out a helping hand to Washington to help neutralize the Shahed attacks across the Gulf. A group of Ukrainian experts has arrived in the Middle East as the cost on the battlefield is ramping up. Yet the losses could have been prevented as President Zelenskyy offered the U.S. counter-drone support last year, but the help was dismissed. Paweł Trzaskowski has the details.
Iranian Shahed drone. Estimated cost $20,000 to $50,000, but shooting it down costs the American taxpayer up to $1 million. This is how much it costs to fire a Patriot missile to neutralize threats like the Shahed, and that's how the US military is now mostly dealing with Iranian drones targeting their bases in the Middle East. But cost is only part of the problem.
Of the 3 different missiles fired by the Patriot batteries, the Patriot system, the MSE is the top of the capability, range, altitude, so on. We have been producing, this is incredible, 500 of those per year.
But reportedly, over 800 Patriot missiles were used within the first few days of hostilities in the Middle East.
We just don't make enough equipment. And the surging of American defense industrial capability has been at a snail's pace.
However, there is a cheaper and abundant alternative: Ukrainian drones such as Skyfall or Sting. Already battle-proven, they boast a 90% success interception rate against Shahed-type drones and cost mere $2,000 apiece. And this week, Washington finally sought Kyiv's help. Ukrainian interceptor drones and a team of specialists were dispatched to help with airspace protection.
As for the situation in the Middle East, we sent our teams. 3 professional teams, fully staffed. All 3 will be in 3 different countries this week. The first 3 countries, according to our agreements, are Qatar, the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia.
In exchange, Ukraine expects to receive more air defense missiles for Patriot batteries. But according to US news outlet Axios, Kyiv had already extended a helping hand in August last year during the Zelenskyy-Trump meeting in Washington. This bid was confirmed on Tuesday by Ukraine's President Zelenskyy. At the time, Ukraine reportedly offered to help the US produce up to 20 million interceptor drones, but the offer was dismissed.
There's no way.
And now, with the war in Iran well into its second week, Washington seemingly regrets rebuffing the offer and calls the decision one of its biggest tactical miscalculations in this latest conflict. Paweł Trzaskowski, TVP World.
As the eyes of the world are firmly fixed on the Middle East, Ukraine is suffering intensifying attacks from Russia, with dozens wounded in Dnipro and Kharkiv and Shahed drones targeting civilian infrastructure. This as Donald Trump praises a positive call with Vladimir Putin. Piotr Kuchma reports.
Overnight Russian attacks struck the Ukrainian city of Dnipro. In Kharkiv, Russian Shahed drones, the same type that threatens US bases in the Middle East, damaged civilian buildings. At least 33 people have been injured over the past 24 hours. And nothing suggests these attacks will stop anytime soon. One reason is the shifting international focus.
At the moment, the partners' priority and all their attention are focused on the situation around Iran. And because of this, the meeting that had been planned for this week is being postponed at the behest of the American side.
It is unclear when they could resume. For Kyiv, this is close to a worst-case scenario. Moreover, European Council President Antonio Costa warned that the rising global energy prices could strengthen Russia's position.
It gains new resources to finance its war against Ukraine as energy prices rise. It profits from the diversion of military capabilities that could otherwise have been sent to support Ukraine.
Despite Zelensky's warnings that Moscow is trying to exploit instability in the Middle East to support its campaign in Ukraine, the US president said he had what he described as a very good phone call with Vladimir Putin.
We were talking about Ukraine, which is just a never-ending fight. And look, there's tremendous hatred between President Putin and President Zelenskyy. They can't seem to get it together. But I think it was a positive call on that subject.
So far, none of the calls have meant anything in substance, and we keep hearing that Putin's ready to make a deal, and he always walks away.
After the call with Putin, Trump also said the United States is preparing to waive certain oil-related sanctions in an effort to stabilize global energy prices as the war involving Iran pushes markets higher.
So we have sanctions on some countries. We're going to take those sanctions off.
There are concerns that the administration may be considering easing restrictions on Russian oil. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz said Berlin sees no reason to reconsider sanctions against Moscow.
Faced with a choice of sanctions or solidarity, our position is clear. We stand with Ukraine and are prepared to endure such a phase if necessary. Aid to Ukraine must not be interrupted.
As Russian drone and missile attacks continue to hit Ukrainian cities, Kyiv says it remains ready for trilateral peace talks at any moment. Piotr Kuchma, TVP World.
Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk is accusing the country's conservative president of trying to block the EU safe loan for defense for political reasons. The president announced his own alternative to the European program, but its details raise questions among financial experts. Kazimierz Łysiak explains the political clash over Polish defense spending in this next report.
Up to 44 billion euro, that's how much Poland aims to spend on defense using the safe loan mechanism of the European Union, but it first needs to overcome a major hurdle in the form of the country's own president.
We received information that President Nawrocki has made the decision to veto the bill on implementing the SAFE program. I'll ask him face to face if that's true. If it is, that would be an unforgivable mistake.
Conservative President Karol Nawrocki has openly criticized the SAFE program. He's not a fan of the way it enforces investments in European arms industries, nor of the very preferential interest at roughly 3%, both of which are key ideas behind the mechanism meant to make Europe more self-reliant. Instead, Nawrocki and the governor of Poland's central bank came up with a national alternative.
Today we sent the presidential draft bill to parliament. We call it the Polish zero-interest safe alternative because we're able to generate additional 40 billion euro in the next 4 to 5 years without any costs and without decreasing our gold reserves.
But the solution is full of caveats, namely the complicated way of using the country's robust gold reserves without actually selling them, which experts say would not only be risky but also unconstitutional.
From the legal point of view, it's not possible, obviously, because the foreign exchange reserve, by constitution, the central bank cannot finance the needs of the government.
Government officials also haven't completely dismissed this alternative. They argue both mechanisms should be utilized, with the bill on implementing the European SAFE program already on the president's desk. But will he sign it into law? The problem is that the case is not just about defense.
The president prepared a draft bill which is aimed to be an excuse to veto the European program. I think right now we are dealing with nothing else but a political game, to block me and pretend you have an alternative.
So I think that the whole issue is entirely political. I think that the president and his environment, they really prefer the solutions which have nothing to do with the European Union. And they are looking for the ways to bypass the EU.
Still, even if President Nawrocki vetoes the bill on the European SAFE program, the government says it has a plan B.
I warned the president that even without the signed bill, we will find ways to get at least some of this money to the Polish army, albeit with a loss.
President Nawrocki has 10 more days to sign the bill on the European SAFE program or veto it. For TVP World, Kazimierz Łysiak.
As global oil prices remain high, world leaders gathered in Paris to discuss the future of nuclear energy at a summit hosted by President Emmanuel Macron. The French head of state hopes to make nuclear a central pillar to Europe's future energy security. Our correspondent Alex Cadier brings us more from Brussels.
Well, the big question in Brussels and across the European Union will be, what does Europe do if the war in Iran rumbles on and continues to hike oil prices higher and higher, prompting perhaps an energy crisis? We've seen European Union finance ministers looking at that question here in Brussels, but so too in Paris. This nuclear energy summit hosted by the French President Emmanuel Macron will be now part perhaps of a longer-term strategy for Europe when it comes to its energy and electricity supply. We know from the head of the IAEA, Rafael Grossi, that 60 countries are considering nuclear power, but of course the upfront investment remains very large. It will be a boon for France in particular, one of the largest fleets of nuclear reactors in the world, second only to the United States, but also one of the key exporters of nuclear technology, civilian nuclear technology, which would be of interest for Poland, the Netherlands, other European countries who want to expand their nuclear program, their civilian nuclear energy production. One country that has done the complete opposite in the last 15 years is Germany. A minister at the time, Ursula von der Leyen, the now Commission president, has said that the moving away from nuclear in Europe was a mistake.
In 1990, 1/3 of Europe's electricity came from nuclear. Today, it's only close to 15%. This reduction in the share of nuclear was a choice. And in hindsight, it was a strategic mistake for Europe to turn its back on a reliable, affordable source of low-emission power.
But as always, when there are discussions about nuclear, that energy production, that source of electricity, not always to everybody's liking. The French president, therefore, pushing for nuclear in Europe, saying that it can be used to power data centers, which in turn power AI technology, in turn boost Europe's competitiveness in that field. The French president very keen to push for nuclear energy. There will be some doubters, but what we've seen with the volatility of oil and gas, not just in the last week, but also since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, means that nuclear now more appealing across Europe. In Brussels, I'm Alex Cadier for TVP World.
The temperature is rising ahead of the April general election in Hungary, with opposition leader Péter Magyar warning the public of Prime Minister Viktor Orbán bracing to, quote, launch a disinformation campaign prepared jointly with Russian political strategists, unquote, with a focus on social media platforms. This, as an anti-Ukrainian campaign by the ruling party, is already in full force. Andrew Sweeney has the latest.
General elections in Hungary are scheduled for April 12. The governing party, the anti-EU Fidesz, is falsely accusing Ukraine of election interference.
The Ukrainians are interfering in the Hungarian elections in a much harsher way than ever before. What do they want? They want a pro-Ukraine government led by a pro-Ukraine prime minister.
The party is behind an opposed to pro-Europe teaser, led by Peter Magyar. In response, it's doubling down on anti-Ukraine rhetoric, off and online.
Fidesz has relatively little to highlight when it comes to its recent record, so it needs to escalate a conflict where it can appear tough and when it can show to the electorate that it's standing up for what it sees as the Hungarian national interest.
Pro-Russian Ukrainians have started to appear frequently in Hungary's social media algorithms, including Diana Panchenko, a propagandist linked to oligarch Viktor Medvedchuk, a close ally of Russian President Vladimir Putin.
Many are afraid to speak the truth.
A team of Russian election agents is reportedly in Budapest advising Fidesz's leader and Hungary's Prime Minister, Viktor Orbán. That team is led by Sergei Kirienko, seen here on the right. Kirienko advised the pro-Russian camp in Moldova's parliamentary elections last year. Magyar claims Kirienko's team is about to launch a smear campaign in Hungary this week, based on its experience in Moldova.
Fidesz, with the help of Russian intelligence services, will launch a smear and disinformation campaign previously tested in Moldova, primarily on social media, especially on TikTok. They will launch the operation on Thursday. There are already 14 AI-generated smear videos prepared about the TISA parliamentary candidate and his family members.
Russians are not using the qualitative approach, but rather quantitative. Awareness of Russians meddling actually helps also to counter this interference.
On Sunday, March 15th, a rally will be held in Budapest, which Magyar claims will be seen from the moon and Moscow. That might eclipse Fidesz's disinformation campaign. For TVP World in Budapest, Andrew Sweeney.
Following turbulent 11 days since the start of the war in Iran and warnings of catastrophic consequences for the oil industry and global markets, is the war between Iran, the U.S. and Israel going as Donald Trump envisaged? To answer this and more, Mark Toth, the co-founder of IntRep 360, a platform focused on national security and foreign policy analysis, joins me on World News tonight. Mark, great to have you back on the show. Thank you for joining.
Great, thank you. Good to be here.
So with the latest developments in the Middle East, the attacks, their intensity, the volatile oil prices, do you think that Donald Trump is going to continue the war in Iran, or perhaps he's going to drop it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think at high altitude, he has to continue this war. That's what his military advisors are going to be telling him. At this point in time, yes, the military destruction of Iran is going according to plan. There are some setbacks. The ability of Iranian drones to attack U.S. forces has been problematic, but they're not decisive and they're not diminishing U.S. military power in the region. But the objectives in terms of regime change, in terms of securing the nuclear fissile material, the 460 kilos of highly enriched uranium to 60%, those two matters have not been solved. And so from that standpoint, Trump has to continue this war until ultimately you see the nuclear question or that file closed, but also some type of better regime than what we have. Because if Khamenei's son does end up being in power, we've heard that he's been announced as the leader, but no one has seen him yet other than AI images of him. Then he's going to be more radical than his father, and Iran will be only more dangerous going forward. And I don't think CENTCOM, in terms of managing the Straits of Hormuz going forward into the next decade, wants to deal with an even more radical version of Khamenei sitting in power in Tehran. So I think this war continues, no matter what Trump may be signaling in the short term, to manage oil expectations across the globe.
We've heard that after an election of the next Supreme Leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, Donald Trump was reluctant to speak to him and to have any sort of a conversation when it comes to a potential ceasefire. Have we arrived at a point of no return when it comes to the way in which the previous Supreme Leader was being killed, where we're not going to see the U.S. speaking to Iran to find a common ground?
I think the U.S. wants to find someone. I think they were hopeful that that person might come from the IRGC itself. a Delcy Rodriguez-type scenario, if you will, in Venezuela, but just transferred that onto the situation in Iran. I don't think that's going to happen. The IRGC is making it very clear on multiple levels that they intend to fight, and they are fighting, albeit asymmetrically, not in a conventional way. But they've also been heavily supportive of making sure that Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of Khamenei that was killed, is in power. But again, we don't know if even he knows he's in power. There's also reports out there that he was badly wounded in the strike that killed his father, and he may be propped up because, again, as I mentioned a few seconds ago, all we have is AI images of him. So it's interesting from my standpoint as an analyst, that the IRGC is wanting him. That means he's their candidate, but is using his imagery now to continue this fight. So from that standpoint, I do think it's past no return, because if you look at Khamenei's son's background, everything about him just says he's more radical than his father. His power base grew up through the IRGC itself. It also grew up in the economic empire behind them. And so he represents not just more of the same, but more of the same to an even greater level, and not in a good way. He'll be much worse as a leader.
Do you think that Israel and the U.S. are still on the same page when it comes to war in Iran, or are we starting to see some sort of polarization?
There could be some differences. Look, Trump has to manage the United States at this point in time in an election year. So oil obviously is an Achilles heel here, and he's trying to manage the idea that global oil markets have gotten out of control. We saw spiking over $100 a barrel. It's dropped off somewhat today. It's roughly $90 a barrel. The Brent crude price, when it first came on, today was trading at that. But I also noticed that options are basically pricing in price increases as well. So the world is betting so far, at least the options market, that this war continues. And so earlier, it was reported by Axios that the U.S. had asked Israel to stop hitting oil and energy infrastructures. That Trump really views that still as simply a doomsday scenario. But I think that's a doomsday scenario that might well be in the making. Israel may just be ahead of that curve. So I don't know that they're not on the same page. It just may be that Israel is a page or two ahead of where the U.S. may have to get to. But I think Iran is going to try to force that doomsday scenario because they see that as an asymmetrical opportunity through oil, through closing the Straits of Hormuz, to fight back at the U.S. So the U.S. may get to where Israel is at, but just in a day or two more. Time will tell.
Mm-hmm. We need to talk Russia because we've heard about the suspension of sanctions on Russian oil. We've also heard an interesting quote from Vaibhav Ranghunan, from the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air, who spoke to the BBC and said it's a bit of a gut punch for, I would say, Ukrainian support, simply because this is a huge, huge oxygen boost for Russia, unquote. Donald Trump is said to have had a positive talk with Vladimir Putin over the phone. Do you think that President Trump will be more accommodating of Vladimir Putin right now as this whole situation in the Middle East unfolds?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it depends at what altitude you want to look at it at. I think all of us are concerned about the relationship that Trump has with Vladimir Putin. When the two meet, when the two talk, bad things seem to happen to Ukraine, and that's not good. And I don't find that acceptable, from my own personal standpoint. That said, I think a little bit of what we're seeing right now is Trump trying to manage Putin so that he doesn't come to a more active aid. We already have information that Russia is providing targeting information to Tehran to hit U.S. forces and key assets in the region, including the THAAD radar systems, and probably trying to manage that somewhat to say, look, if I take these sanctions off, at least for now, and allow India to buy Russian oil, will you back off on that? There could be a bit of horse trading going on here, as we like to say in the United States. But I also think that's aimed at trying to keep Putin out, to become more actively involved in any meaningful way in what's going on in the war in Iran. It's unfortunate, though, for the messaging that it sends to Ukraine, because certainly they've earned better, not just from the U.S., but Europe as well. And anything that helps Russia helps the war that Russia is prosecuting against Ukraine. And that's not good. The only thing that I might add, though, there is a double-edged sword here, because if oil prices go higher, that lifts all boats, and that ultimately helps Putin. So if Putin is trading off the black market to places like India, et cetera, without these sanctions, that'll help somewhat suppress oil revenues, so he makes a little less. So it's not a one-to-one type scenario. Like anything in life, it's somewhat complicated and double-edged.
Just before we go, I wanted to bring a statement because we know that Ukraine sent a team of drone experts to aid the U.S. in the Middle East because of the costs that this war is incurring. As we read in the statement by President Zelenskyy, those seeking support from Ukraine must continue to assist our defense, especially our air defense. Last year, we proposed an agreement to the United States regarding drones. This is the right approach, cooperating with us on drone production and deployment. Is this how Ukraine can really get its foot in the door with the U.S. to make sure that Russia is not getting its way in its entirety when it comes to the U.S., when it comes to potential peace talks in the future?
Yeah, it should. Look, Ukraine a year ago could have avoided, on behalf of the United States, a lot of the problems that we're seeing, including the destruction of some very expensive radar systems for the THAAD in Jordan, as well as in Kuwait, that we've seen the Iranians hit with very basically cheap Shahed drones. And that help was refused a year ago. And I think that's a scandal that'll come out more in the U.S. in the days ahead, or at least in the days and months after this war finally concludes, why we didn't take that. It should be the card that Trump keeps claiming that Ukraine doesn't have. Unfortunately, so far, what we've seen out of Trump himself is he's trying to downplay Ukraine's contribution to this type of drone defense that they're now offering to the Gulf states in particular to stop these Iranian drones from being able to hit port facilities, oil refineries. They've even hit office buildings as well as the airport. Again, this is something that the U.S. should have been in front of curve-wise, and they simply weren't. Day late, dollar short, and the Ukrainians were there. But unfortunately, I don't think Trump's going to give him enough credit for that. I think he's still after trying to force Ukraine into a peace deal with Russia. And I think in that regard, it's not going to be the playing card that all of us would hope that it would be, even though Ukraine deserves that. Because clearly it would have helped tremendously. And at this point in time, one last quick point here, Ukraine is not likely to get any air defense assets that they need desperately now, anytime soon, given just the needs, the interceptor requires, et cetera, that are used for Patriots in the Mideast until this war is over. So it's going to be a difficult climb for Ukraine for the next couple of weeks.
I'm really sorry to interrupt, Mark, but unfortunately our time on the program has come to an end. Thank you so much for joining me on the program, and I hope we get to continue this conversation. Mark Toth, the co-founder of IntRep 360, was my guest here on the program.
Thank you.
Thank you. And so this would be all for now. Thank you for joining. I'm Claudia Czerwińska. I hope to see you back here on TVP World for more in just a moment. Until then, good night.